Out to the fallout, and it continues over the Justice Department's failure to meet the deadline to release all, that's what the law requires, all of the Jeffrey Epstein files. Democratic Congressman Khanna and Republican Congressman Massie, they authored the law, announced late last night that they will bring inherent contempt charges against Attorney General Pam Bondi. In a statement, Khanna called the DOJ's failure to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, quote, an obstruction of justice, unquote. CBS News Department of Justice reporter Jake Rosen joins me now. Jake, walk me through what this means that the two lawmakers are trying to set in motion and what it might mean for the Attorney General, if anything.
I need to tell you about a major development that just happened regarding the Epstein files, and it shows you that at least some members of Congress are finally willing to use their actual power to force accountability. Democratic Congressman Khanna and Republican Congressman Massie, the two lawmakers who literally wrote the Epstein Files Transparency Act, announced late last night that they're bringing inherent contempt charges against Attorney General Pam Bondi. This is a big deal, and it's exactly the kind of action we need to see more of when the executive branch simply decides laws don't apply to them.
Well, what it might mean, Major, is a potential $5,000 a day fine after a 30-day grace period. Our audience will remember on the 19th of this month is when these Epstein files were due in full to be delivered to the American people in some kind of searchable format. That has not happened. We've seen a trickle come out even as early as overnight from Monday into Tuesday. The Department of Justice has said these filings and these drops of documents are going to continue as attorneys continue to sort through them, redact sensitive information, and then release them. But again, the language of the law was very clear, which is what Khanna and Massie have pointed to, which is that these files should have come out on the 19th in full. What this would mean is potentially a $5,000 a day fine, if not potentially moving further to hold Attorney General Bondi and potentially Deputy Attorney General Blanche in contempt of Congress.
In a statement, Khanna called the Justice Department's failure to comply with the law an obstruction of justice, and he's absolutely right. This isn't about missing a suggested deadline or falling behind on a request. Congress passed a law with bipartisan support that Trump himself signed, requiring the release of all Epstein files by December 19th. Not some of them. Not a slow trickle spread out over months. All of them in a searchable format by that specific date.
That being said, Major, Khanna said on a media appearance earlier this week that this really is not about those two. It's about President Trump and holding these powerful men who were associated with Jeffrey Epstein accountable. As you know, there are a number of documents potentially relating to co-conspirators who were never indicted that he wants to see released. And he said that that's really what this is about, forcing information that has not yet been out before this 30-day grace period. He's willing to give these members of the Department of Justice out.
The law was crystal clear on this point. What we've gotten instead is a strategic, manipulated release designed to serve Trump's political interests rather than deliver transparency. Files have been posted and taken down, documents have been released with arbitrary redactions that violate the law, fake materials have been mixed in with real ones. Bill Clinton was featured prominently in early releases, while Trump material was hidden or obscured. And the whole process has been managed not to inform the public, but to control the narrative and protect powerful people from accountability. So what does inherent contempt actually mean, and why does it matter? This is Congress using one of its most powerful but rarely invoked constitutional tools. If Bondi is found in inherent contempt, she would face a potential $5,000 per day fine after a 30-day grace period. That might not sound like much for someone at her level, but it's the principle and the precedent that matters. Congress is asserting that when the executive branch defies a law, there are actual consequences, not just strongly worded letters and empty threats. Beyond the fines, this could potentially escalate to holding both Attorney General Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Blanche in contempt of Congress, which carries more serious ramifications, including potential criminal referrals. Now, realistically, who would prosecute that? The Justice Department would have to prosecute its own leadership, which obviously isn't going to happen under Trump. But the political and legal pressure that comes from an inherent contempt finding is significant. It puts a spotlight on the violation, it creates an official congressional record of wrongdoing, and it establishes precedent for future action when adults are back in charge of the executive branch. By the way, I am trying to do my best to gather all the information I can for you and share it with you. Please leave your likes and comments, and I would be grateful if you subscribed. Let's continue. Jake Rosen from CBS News reported on this and made an important point. Khanna said on a media appearance that this really isn't about Bondi and Blanche personally. It's about President Trump and holding the powerful men who were associated with Jeffrey Epstein accountable. There are documents potentially relating to 10 co-conspirators who were never indicted that Khanna wants released. And he said forcing that information out during this 30-day grace period before fines kick in is really what this is about. That's the right framing because while Bondi and Blanche are the ones technically in violation of the law, they're following Trump's orders. Trump is the one who doesn't want full transparency because he knows what's in those files. He knows how damaging it would be if everything came out. So he's using Bondi as a shield, making her take the heat for defying Congress while he stays in the background claiming he wants transparency too, but his Justice Department is just being thorough and careful. Khanna specifically referenced the newest batch of files that contained information contradicting things FBI Director Kash Patel had previously testified about before Congress. This is crucial because it shows Patel may have committed perjury. When Patel testified, he said there was no evidence that Jeffrey Epstein trafficked women to other potential unindicted co-conspirators. He made it sound like Epstein acted alone or only with Ghislaine Maxwell, and that extensive investigations found no one else was involved. But internal documents that have now been released, or at least referred to in emails that have been released, cite potentially 10 unindicted co-conspirators that we didn't know about. So either Patel was lying when he testified, or he was so incompetent and uninformed that he didn't know about 10 co-conspirators in the most high-profile case his agency is handling. Either way, it's grounds for serious consequences. Lying to Congress is a felony. And if you're the FBI director and you don't know about 10 co-conspirators in a major sex trafficking investigation, you're not competent to hold that position. Now, Jake Rosen made a fair point that it's really difficult to hold the FBI and Justice Department accountable through any enforcement mechanism because the eventual enforcer is themselves or the executive branch. That's the fundamental problem with Trump controlling these institutions. Who investigates the investigators when they're all working for the same corrupt president? Who prosecutes perjury when the prosecutors report to the person who benefits from the lies? But that doesn't mean Congress is powerless. Inherent contempt is one of the few tools that doesn't require the executive branch to cooperate. Congress can levy fines directly. They can issue their own enforcement mechanisms. And while they can't throw Bondi in jail without DOJ cooperation, they can make her life miserable. They can ensure this becomes a defining issue of her tenure, and they can lay the groundwork for future prosecution when Trump is no longer president. What we don't have yet are the full names of these 10 co-conspirators. We know they exist because internal DOJ and FBI documents reference them. We know some have been served with grand jury subpoenas. We know attempts were made to locate others who were described as outstanding. We know one was identified as a wealthy businessman in Ohio, which everyone assumes is Les Wexner given his close business relationship with Epstein. But we don't have official confirmation of who these people are or why they were never indicted despite being identified as co-conspirators. That's the information Khanna and Massie are trying to force out through these contempt proceedings. They want those names. They want the evidence that led FBI and prosecutors to designate these people as co-conspirators. They want explanations for why, if there was enough evidence to call them co-conspirators, there wasn't enough evidence to indict them. And they want the American people to have access to all of this so we can make informed judgments about whether justice was actually pursued or whether powerful people were protected. As Jake noted, the Justice Department has said that document releases will continue as attorneys sort through them and redact sensitive information. But that framing is misleading because it makes it sound like this is just a time and resource issue, that they need more time to do the work carefully. In reality, they've had months to prepare for this. The law was passed with plenty of advance notice. They claim to have had 1,000 lawyers working on this since March, and the redactions they're making appear to violate the law, which explicitly limits what can be withheld. The slow dribble of releases isn't about being thorough, it's about controlling the narrative. Release some Clinton material to make it look like Democrats are implicated too. Hide or obscure Trump material to protect him. Redact the names of co-conspirators to protect powerful people. Mix in some fake documents to create confusion and undermine trust in the real evidence. And drag the whole process out so that by the time everything is finally released, if it ever is, public attention has moved on and the impact is minimized. That's why Khanna is willing to give the Justice Department this 30-day grace period before fines start, but only if they actually use that time to release real information in compliance with the law. He's drawing a line and saying, we'll give you one more chance to do this right, but if you continue to defy the law, there will be consequences. That's what oversight is supposed to look like. Not endless hearings where officials refuse to answer questions with no repercussions. Actual use of congressional power to enforce the law. Jake mentioned that the Justice Department has said they're actively investigating any potential fallout and could potentially prosecute people if they choose to when these documents come out. But that rings incredibly hollow given everything we've seen about how this DOJ operates. They've spent the last 10 months firing career prosecutors, politicizing investigations, going after Trump's enemies while protecting his friends, and refusing to pursue public integrity cases. The idea that they're going to suddenly prosecute wealthy, powerful co-conspirators in the Epstein case based on evidence they're currently trying to hide is laughable. That's why public pressure matters so much. Jake's right that there's enormous public interest in these files, and that pressure could potentially force more accountability and transparency. But it only works if people actually pay attention and demand action. Trump is counting on exhaustion, on people getting overwhelmed by the volume of scandals and corruption, on the Epstein story getting buried under tariff debates and immigration raids and whatever the next distraction is. Khanna and Massie bringing inherent contempt charges is a signal that at least some members of Congress aren't going to let that happen. They wrote this law specifically to force transparency that the Justice Department wouldn't provide voluntarily. They got it passed with bipartisan support. Trump signed it because politically he couldn't afford to veto an Epstein transparency bill. And now they're using every tool at their disposal to actually enforce what the law requires. This is what checks and balances are supposed to look like. The legislative branch using its constitutional authority to hold the executive branch accountable when it defies the law. Not just complaining about it, not just holding hearings where nothing happens. Actually using power, inherent contempt, fines, official findings of wrongdoing to create consequences for lawlessness. Will it work? That depends on whether enough members of Congress support it, whether public pressure builds to make it politically necessary, and whether courts uphold Congress's inherent contempt authority if challenged. But at minimum, Khanna and Massie are doing what they should be doing, refusing to accept obstruction as normal, using their power rather than just their platform, and fighting for the transparency that survivors and the American people deserve. The 30-day grace period is both generous and strategic. It gives Bondi one last chance to comply, which makes the case stronger if she doesn't. It shows Congress is being reasonable and not rushing to punishment, and it creates a clear timeline and deadline that everyone can watch. Either the Justice Department releases what the law requires in the next 30 days, or they face escalating fines and contempt findings that will define this entire scandal. My guess is they won't comply fully, even within that grace period. They'll release more documents in a slow drip, claim they're making progress, insist they need more time, and continue to redact information the law says they can't withhold. And when that happens, when the 30 days expire and compliance still hasn't occurred, Congress needs to follow through, impose the fines, issue the contempt findings, refer for criminal prosecution even knowing DOJ won't act on it. Create the record so that history and hopefully future prosecutors can hold people accountable. Because if Congress doesn't follow through, if they give another extension and another until everyone forgets or gives up, then the Epstein Files Transparency Act becomes meaningless. It joins the pile of laws that powerful people can simply ignore without consequence. And we've established once again that when you're close enough to Trump, when you're protecting Trump, the law just doesn't apply to you. That's not a precedent we can afford to set, and it's not a country we can afford to become. So pay attention to what happens over the next 30 days. Watch whether the Justice Department actually complies or continues to obstruct. Watch whether Congress follows through on inherent contempt or backs down when Trump applies pressure. Watch whether the media covers this as the constitutional crisis it is or treats it as just another political squabble. And demand that your representatives support transparency and accountability because this matters far beyond Jeffrey Epstein. This is about whether laws mean anything when the powerful decide to defy them.